Hello, my name's Mark Ashton. I'm Professor of Silviculture. And today we're going to do the second part of the set of videos that I talked about in terms of irregular shelterwoods, dealing with second growth hardwood forests of northeastern America, particularly in southern New England. And for this second part, we'll be starting with the older treatments, starting basically with mid-stem exclusion stands that originated from Shelterwoods 20 years ago. And then we're going to walk backwards, slowly, sort of into the more recent time. So we'll have Shelterwoods that are 13 years, 7 years, 4 years, and then an example of a Shelterwood which has been freshly treated this year. And interwoven in that, as we go sort of into the present, you'll see the difference in stand development between mid-stem exclusion all the way down through to very early initiation stages of stand dynamics in these second growth shelterwoods, with these various kinds of reserves and structures that we leave behind. So therefore, they're all irregular shelterwoods. But within that, we have 3 7-year shelterwoods, stands that originated 7 years ago, as examples of different kinds of spacings that we use for different kinds of sites. We have an example that I believe is stop 3, which is an example of what we do on uplands, dry, thin to bedrock till soils where oak is very easy to secure, and hickory. And the mesic hardwoods don't really come back in a competitive way because it's a much drier kind of site. You'll see that we can retain a lot more structure as irregular shelterwoods on those sites. And then as we go down slope, stops 4 and 5, you'll see that our spacing and our requirements and our abilities to leave legacy structures, the spacing gets further and further apart, and we tend to try and group the structures together to sort of reduce the edge effect. And as you go down slope, the competition in the understory becomes more and more vigorous, and so we have to open up that spacing to let more and more light, to create more of an desiccating environment, more and more of a brighter environment, to allow for the second growth hardwoods that would be considered intermediate in shade tolerance to be competitive on those sites, the more drought tolerant ones, to be more competitive on those sites, particularly as the black birch becomes more and more prolific as you go down slope. So that's the nature of these, the order of what we're going to be doing today. So let's start with this particular stand, the oldest stand in this sort of chronosequence that we're going to be looking through. And in this circumstance, this is over a 20-year-old regeneration, basically an irregular shelterwood. But what you see in the canopy is there's not much overstory that's been left. There's actually very little that's been left. And so everything else, you're looking at 20 years of free-to-grow stands, and you can see that in most circumstances, we have black birch, paper birch, still in the canopy, with a good amount of pine coming up on this canopy, and then into the sub-canopy, and also oak. And there are sort of elements of laurel on this particular stand. This is a relatively mesic stand. It's actually very competitive in terms of black birch, trying to exclude, particularly black birch is a fast-growing but rarely shade-tolerant hardwood. It can, on our sites in this forest, it can easily outcompete some of the more shade-intermediate species that are more drought-tolerant. Species like the oak and species like the hickory. So you're looking at 20 years of growth. You can also see in the subcanopy elements of the more shade-tolerant species that can exist on this site, like hemlock, right here. And the pine will exist beneath the birch on this kind of sort of phenological window where the evergreens can subsist. All 3 evergreens can subsist on this kind of site. The shrub, laurel, mountain laurel, the hemlock, and the white pine. So this is a great example of a stand regenerated from a shelterwood on a mid sort of slopes stand, relatively sort of moist A lot of competition for oak to gain on this particular stand, but it's very competitive, and it's what we do to the oak to try and promote its release on these kinds of sites. On these kinds of sites, if we want to get oak and we want to get hickory, we have to actually develop some cleanings and some release treatments. So in these 20-year-old stem exclusion stands that are exceedingly competitive for black birch, and where we wanted to make sure that the oak grow into the canopy, on these kinds of sites, it's moist enough, we will have to try and provide release treatments. And these kinds of release treatments are really cleanings. And this is a great example. In this case, this is yellow birch, and it has basically been taken out, okay, to release this oak here. There's a number of oak. This is another oak here, and then there's an oak over here. But the idea is to judiciously take out competing overtopped oak to release the oak, and the species that you're taking out are usually either black birch, sometimes it's yellow birch, sometimes it's red maple sprouts. And it's really because on these kinds of sites in thick stem exclusion at 20 years old, oak might have a hard time trying to make it, particularly with the black birch competition. So this is a irregular shelterwood, and you can see the individual reserves and on occasional group reserves left, white pine reserves, some of the larger oak reserves, all these purposefully left really to add structure, both in terms of compositional structure and as a food source for many of the wildlife that depend on elements of later successional age classes for a much younger stand that's been developed. So this stand has regenerated from an irregular shelterwood on a gently sloping northwest slope, somewhat mesic, but also somewhat dry. There's not a sugar maple component in here, and there's not really a beech component in here. So the oak is more competitive on this side, as is the hickory. And this shelterwood was cut back in 2010, so it's around a 10-year-old shelterwood that you're looking at in terms of an initiating stand. It's still in initiating, but it's beginning to close. It's beginning to enter into early stem exclusion. So what do we see? We see all the players initiating either from advanced regeneration or from the buried seed bank or from seed rain, and in some cases from sprouts too. So what you can see here, this is advanced regeneration with red maple, and it's again back in the canopy. You're looking at early stem exclusion or late initiation here, and so red maple is very much, advanced regeneration is very much in the canopy in this example. In other examples, you can find advanced regeneration maple that is actually much smaller than that. And if you look at the back there, and I'll go back to that later, that is sprout origin red maple, and that's really very much in the canopy, a tree of the present canopy. And then what's in the mid-story? Well, advanced regeneration release of hickory. So you can see this is the mockernut hickory here, and then you can see the ubiquitous birch, both in the subcanopy and the understory and in the canopy. All this is birch. This is all mostly black birch. And then also you can see a lot of oak. This is sort of in the understory, this particular oak, and then over here you can see right here, this oak is now just descending into the mid-story, in amongst the birch. So this is a good example of where the oak and the hickory are still very much in the mid-story. The understory is primarily a legacy of historical land use. This is old sheep pasture, and much of the mediocre land, the medium kind of site land that this is, was in pasture. Originally, it went to old field pine, cut out, and a lot of this laurel is a signature of what livestock or deer could not eat. It's toxic, and has come back and has really usurped a lot of the ground story, perhaps from recurrent fires back in the turn of the last century that promoted the second growth oak beneath the pine in the first place. And now this has come back in, and it's ubiquitous on these kinds of sites. Old, second growth, mediocre sites which weren't really intensively farmed, but were essentially grazing land, poor grazing land for sheep primarily. This kind of landscape came back in this region of northeastern Connecticut to a lot more laurel. It's clonal, and over long periods of time, one seedling has begotten through layering and through suckering, it has spread out. And so to regenerate the stand on these kinds of sites through Shelterwood, we have to actually do a fairly intensive amount of site preparation, of crushing this laurel to the ground to allow the release of advanced generation. So this is pretty standard on these medium slope sites. And we have to open it up quite dramatically. Not as dramatic as on the most mesic, most productive sites. You can see that the overstory basal area probably represents around 15 to 20 square feet per acre. But it's enough to really release the oak above the laurel and the hickory above the laurel. And this is what's happening right here. You can see that the oak now is above the laurel, given the fact that there's enough light to allow it to go through. So in addition, I wanted to show you, as I mentioned, the red maple, which is of proud origin. So here's a great example of a red maple in the canopy, even above the black birch. The other thing that you can think of, on this kind of site, it's fairly easy not only to secure the oak and the hickory, as long as you crush the laurel and allow enough light to let that advanced generation come through that laurel, but it's also fairly easy to secure species like pine as an element in the hardwood. And you can see that the actual internode length of pine, this is about a 10-year-old pine that you're looking at. Actually, it's maybe a little younger, but you can see it's growing fairly rapidly. And this is also in the mid-story. This will become eventually a pine, oak, hickory canopy, but not yet. So this is stop 3. And this is what you're looking at here is 7 years after an irregular shelterwood on an upland site, a dry site with a southern aspect. And you can see on the ground a lot of carex, a lot of low bush blueberry. And this is a site in which we can really quite easily regenerate oak. In some cases, we can actually do some prescribed burns too. But we can regenerate oak and we can regenerate hickory, and it can essentially sit on the ground for 40 odd years before we even start thinking about doing a shelterwood. And so it's relatively easy to just release the oak, release the hickory, and then leave a lot of structure in the overstory. And this is what you're seeing here. The remaining structure is here just to stay, with the oaks and the hickories growing up around. And you can see pretty much all the trees that are remaining are either subcanopy or canopy, oak and hickory. And so here it's very easy to regenerate. It's also very easy to make this a multi-age stand, a conversion from a second growth hardwood stand to a multi-age stand relatively easily, because the oak has no mesic competition. On occasion, maybe some black birch, as you can see here, but it's very patchy. And so there's no real mesic competition, there's no mesification of these stands. And so regenerating oak on these stands with hickory, with an overstory, retaining a lot of the reserve structure, so that you have maybe 2 or 3 age classes, is really easy as single reserves that you can see right here. They're not really grouped. A uniform canopy structure, a uniform older structure, and the capacity to release the regeneration back into that canopy structure, primarily because all the species that are regenerating are fairly drought tolerant, and it's a much brighter, lower statured forest, relatively less productive forest as compared to some of the other stops that we're going to be going to for the same age as we go down slope. So this is the mid-slope site. This is the site in regards to a slope glacial till soil, relatively unproductive, but not as unproductive as the upland site and not as productive as the bottomland site. So what you see here is, again, a 7-year-old stand. It's mixed, clearly relatively poor soil in the sense of the laurel tells you this was, again, poor pasture, like so many of the sites, mid-slope. But what you can see is really 3 age classes going on. You can see the oldest age class, the structures which are quite close together. You can hold on to a canopy of overstory oak with some residual legacy trees of white oak and hemlock and various kinds of hickories and red maple that might be left as legacies, primarily because this is a really poor site. It's droughty, and so it's good for pine, it's good for oak, and it's good for hickory. But so that's one age class, and this is 7 years old. It's had the removal cutting, and what you're looking at is the legacy of that preparatory and establishment treatment. The removal cutting has happened, and so you can see that there's another couple of age classes that are going on here. You can see behind me much larger pine and hemlock, and that is really an age class that developed from a heavy crown thinning where there was enough light to establish pine and hemlock in the understory of the stand about 25 years ago. So you're looking at a residual age class that established 25 years ago, and then 7 years ago the prep and establishment treatment occurred for a shelterwood, which released this and then released the youngest age class, which is only about 7 years, in a patchy way. You're still in sort of mid-initiation of the stand. You still got raspberries and blackberries in here. It's patchy, and you can see the black birch patchily coming in, but you can also see the red maple being the canopy, sprout origin, and then you can see a whole host of other species, but most importantly you can see species like oak coming in amongst the laurel that, in terms of the prep treatment, the laurel was crushed so that one could essentially establish some of these more shade intolerant late successional species like laurel. And we also got some species like white pine and hemlock coming in at the same time, of that vintage, that age class, 7 years old, as compared to the much older, patchily released age class that is now regenerating well and filling up growing space that will be considered in the stem exclusion stage. But most of this stand is mid-slope, quite high in terms of legacy retention, on a relatively poor soil. Laurel's the evidence for that, but the most of it is sort of patchily coming in as a younger age class, 4 years old, and maybe a little older in terms of advanced regeneration of oak. So this is stop 5. This is the toe slope of a stand that was treated, again, 7 years ago. But it's on the bottom slope, northern aspect, northwestern aspect, bottom slope of a drumlin in which subsurface water flow is coming off the hill, and these are deep till soils. And so this would be a mesic, very competitive site for sugar maple, for ash, for tulip poplar. And yet we treated this, and in order to get both ash and tulip poplar and sugar maple regeneration, but also the shade intermediates, being oak and hickory, we had to treat this very dramatically. And so what you can see here are the remnants of the legacy trees that we left behind in a shelterwood that almost resembled a seed tree. We had to actually dramatically open up in the establishment of uniform preparatory treatment of a shelterwood, dramatically open up the canopy, take out all the subcanopy, and leave groups of individuals behind, or single individuals, at about 70 to 75 feet apart. And this is what it looks like after the removal cutting, in which the stand that you see remaining, the legacy trees remaining, are those of the original stand that have been spaced and that are basically going to become the legacy trees in this now what will become a two-aged, young, regenerating Shelterwood origin stand. That is a lot of music competition for species like this. Right here we have a hickory, okay? And then back here we have an oak. I won't point too far. And then of course this is black birch, the most competitive of the tree. And then actually in the understory are sugar maple and some ash. So ash is growing fairly rapidly on these sorts of sites because of the big opening that we've created. But you can see how vigorous now in the mid-initiation stage. This is a 7-year-old stand here. It's still fairly open. We're still, the buried seed bank of blackberries is still here. It's still vigorous. It hasn't been shaded out. And this would be considered mid-initiation, with a certain amount of light still coming in patchily. But the hickory is established. The black birch is well established in strong patches. And over time, the black birch will just fill in, and it'll be in about 4 or 5 years' time, it'll be early stem exclusion. You can see also some pine in this stand. This is another example, pine being a generalist species, little like the oak and the hickory. It's currently sort of in the mid-stratum of the canopy, black birch being in the canopy, that will eventually again be this pine oak canopy, maybe about 30, 40 years' time. So this is the bottom. And this is basically a great example of almost a seed tree kind of treatment, a dramatic treatment to secure oak and hickory with some pine in amongst the mesic hardwoods, and particularly trying to compete and facilitate that regeneration with the competition for black birch, which comes in vigorously. You're looking at a Shelterwood that has had the preparatory and establishment cutting, but not the removal cutting. And so what you see here in the overstory, you can see the spacing of the big overstory trees. You can also see a lot of legacy structure that was arranged, both in terms of snags, and occasionally these white oaks, sometimes sugar maple, a little bit of hemlock. All these are structures that are going to be part of the legacy stand structure after the removal cutting. The removal cutting here has not happened. But if you can imagine all those big trees, you can see there's a really nicely spaced oak, all the big trees, every other oak will be removed, and that will be the removal cutting of an irregular Shelterwood. So there are really two treatments here that will happen. One that has already happened, the establishment of the preparatory treatment, and then in about a year or two's time, the removal treatment of every other big oak tree. The remaining big oak trees will be left, as will all the other structures that relate to wildlife habitat, future potential timber value in the sense of sugar maple. This is an example of a really nice sugar maple right here. And it also tells you that you are on the bottom end of a not the most productive site in terms of mesic hardwoods, but it's on the relatively productive. It still has an enormous amount of laurel in this stand, suggesting that this was old field pasture, not the best arable land that oaks can potentially grow on, and that would be competing with sugar maple and the mesic hardwoods. But here, the kind of oak that you're looking at is actually really small. This is an oak right here. These are all the oaks. These are established, advanced regeneration that are probably about 8 to 12 years old, established in the last mast. And then what you can see here, these are actually understory shrubs. This is witch hazel of sprout origin. And then over there, of course, is the tree of the current canopy of the young regenerating initiating stand. This would be early initiation, is the sprout origin red maple. And then the majority of the matrix that you see here is black birch of seed origin that has come in afterwards. So this is what the structure looks like 4 years after. And this is about the right time to remove some of the overstory canopy and to leave the remaining canopy and all the other legacy structures that have been sort of carefully selected to to move on back into the next two-age stand that you see here. That's what it will become. It should be understood that the kinds of shelterwoods that we do here in northeastern Connecticut combine preparatory and establishment treatments together. Why do we do that? It's really because of logistics, cost, and really the fact that much of our advanced generation is already pre-established through understory initiation of old second growth stands, that we can basically bypass any kind of the preparatory treatments alone. If we just did a preparatory treatment, that might be taking out some of the subcanopy or trying to remove some of the laurel. But that comes with a price. It's costly, and we have to pay for that. By combining it with the establishment treatment, where we both crush the laurel, take out the subcanopy and the understory, cut the understory down like the witch hazel that you see here, and then space the trees and leave the legacies and structures that we want to leave for the next stand into the future, it really reduces costs and really releases the regeneration, much like a windstorm. Rather than trying to iteratively do this, we found it much more successful. So this is a freshly treated year zero, not even just a couple of months old. It was done in the winter of this year, 2020. And this is an irregular shelterwood where we've combined again the preparatory and the establishment treatments together. And so what you see here is there's a certain amount of scarification that we've purposely tried to do to really bury the acorns from the prior mast. And then we've crushed the slash down to the ground. In places, the slash is higher, and that's really where there's advanced regeneration that we protected from deer browse. And then you can see various kinds of reserves that we've left behind. And the first is right here. On this kind of site, this is a relatively moist site. You'll see that the spacing of the canopy, big trees, the oaks, are quite far apart. About 65 feet apart in this spacing, given this kind of site. But we've also left, in order to reduce the edge effect, we've left patches of legacy forest. In this case, you can see this patch here of a relatively what we call large group reserve. And then in places where we've spaced the trees, we've tried to reduce the edge effect by, for example, a big, large parent oak tree as a mast source. And then around it, we've created structure. This hemlock, which provides a lot more vertical structure because it's an evergreen. And then we've got a sugar maple right here, which is probably a tree that, and good sugar maples, there's a couple of good sugar maples we've left as trees potentially of the next generation forest, a much older generation forest, because these are all, this is all second growth. And if you remember in my crown thinning lectures, and my lecture around Shelterwoods Part 1, this is all the same age class. And so if you want to carry sugar maple to full fruition on a sugar maple site, this is a relatively moist site, we will have to take 2 rotations of oak to 1 rotation of sugar maple. And that's why we have these irregular shelterwoods from a commercial perspective. We also have irregular shelterwoods like this, in which we retain all these kinds of structural elements, primarily because of wildlife aspects, wildlife structure, and particularly in terms of bird diversity and retaining bird diversity, and various kinds of small mammals.